Simply because he was an elderly black man with a low income, Luther Rowe was slapped straight across the face by Police Lieutenant Brent Rawlins, right in the middle of the courtroom. Without any warning, the slap cracked through the air like cold steel, and the old man's blood splattered onto his glasses. But the officer's eyes didn't flinch. He believed he had just put a lesser man in his place. What he didn't know was that someone at the back of the room was silently watching everything unfold. That someone was the old man's son, FBI agent Marcus Rowe. What punishment awaits a man who thinks he has the right to crush others simply because he believes they'll stay silent forever? Watch until the end to find out. The courtroom at Winston Hill had the kind of air that didn't move, thick with varnish, stale coffee, and the long breath of justice too often held. The ceiling fan rotated with a mechanical groan, the kind that marked time more than cooled anything. Mr. Luther Rowe, 72 years old, skin worn like dark polished leather from decades of hard sun and harder truths, stood up slowly. His back was still straight, not out of pride, because pride had long been ground into something more durable, but because some men never forget the lesson of standing tall, even when everyone around you is trying to make you small. The moment he straightened his spine and adjusted his posture in front of the bench, it was as if something shifted. Nothing audible, just an energy shift. Brent Rawlins noticed. He always noticed when the wrong kind of people took up space. Middle-aged, blonde, buzz-cut like he never left the force, Brent wore his badge like a brand. His uniform was crisp, the kind of crisp that says, "I iron my power." He stepped forward from the pews with too much eagerness, walking with boots that weren't quiet and a jaw that was already clenched before he opened his mouth. "What are you standing here for?" he barked, loud enough that it echoed off the paneled walls. "Go back to your damn rat hole, old man." The words hit hard, but they weren't the worst part. The worst part was that Brent Rawlins didn't wait for an answer. He wasn't interested in explanations. His hand moved before the sentence was even finished, sharp and fast, like a reflex practiced 100 times but never punished. The crack of palm on flesh rang through the courtroom like a judge's gavel. Luther's head jerked to the side with the force of it. Glasses knocked askew, a thin splatter of blood drawing a cruel arc across the lower rim of his lenses. It wasn't the sound that froze the room. It was the image. The stillness after violence. The violence that didn't need volume to feel loud. No one moved. No one screamed. One woman flinched and turned away. Another raised her phone just high enough to record without being obvious. Somewhere a breath was held and not released. But there were no words, no protests, no eruption of outrage. Just the quiet cowardice of people who had learned that speaking out gets you nowhere, and looking away gets you home in one piece. Brent Rawlins didn't flinch. His face twisted in a sneer, smug and unrepentant. He wiped his hand on his uniform like the touch of Luther Rowe had left a stain. "Should have stayed seated," he muttered under his breath, not even pretending to whisper. Luther said nothing. He didn't stumble. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't reach for a lawyer or the bailiff. He reached for a handkerchief, a white one, neatly folded, soft with years of use and laundry starch. He dabbed at the corner of his mouth with careful precision, more concerned with the stain on the cloth than the blood on his lip. He adjusted his glasses with 2 fingers. One lens had a drop of blood near the center, like a target. He didn't clean that. He let it sit. Brent stared at him for a moment longer, waiting for a reaction that didn't come. Then he scoffed and turned away, walking back to his spot with the satisfaction of someone who thinks he's reminded the world of its place. No one stopped him. Not the judge, not the security, not the system built to protect men like Luther. The silence was loud, almost mocking. And then, from the very last row of the courtroom, a man stood. He didn't make a sound, didn't need to. His presence was enough to tilt the air. He was tall, taller than Brent, but stood like he wanted to disappear. Dark suit, no tie, federal badge tucked just out of view. He looked once toward the front, not at Brent, but at Luther. His eyes didn't widen. His mouth didn't move. The only thing he did was take a breath and walk away. That was Marcus Rowe. He didn't slam the door behind him. He didn't shout a threat or demand justice on the spot. He didn't break the rules. He walked out of the courtroom like the violence had happened before and would happen again. But this time it had touched something sacred. This time it had crossed into blood. No one connected the two men. Old and young, bruised and still, father and son. Not yet. To the onlookers, Marcus was just a man leaving a courtroom in disgust. But to the ones who watched closely, it was clear something else had shifted. Outside, the afternoon sun didn't care what happened inside. It spilled onto the courthouse steps like always. Marcus didn't pause to soak it in. His shoes hit the pavement in rhythm, every step controlled, deliberate. His jaw was tight, not with rage, but with calculation. The kind of tension that says nothing will be forgotten, and everything will be remembered when the time is right. Inside, the courtroom resumed like nothing had happened. Brent smirked to himself. The judge shuffled papers. A clerk typed. Justice moved on, as it always did, over the blood of those too tired or too alone to fight back. But blood on glass is stubborn. It doesn't wipe away clean, not when it means something. And Luther Rowe didn't move to leave either. He stood there with his hands behind his back, watching the space where Brent had stood, eyes not angry, but waiting. That waiting would become a trigger. That slap would become more than just a slap. It would become evidence, a spark, a stain. But while the room drifted back to its clockwork drone, Marcus Rowe didn't drift at all. He walked to his car parked 3 blocks away, a nondescript black sedan with plates registered to an address that didn't technically exist. When he slipped behind the wheel, his hands were steady. His face was blank. Still no calls, no outburst, not yet. This wasn't the moment to speak. It was the moment to record. From the driver's seat, he tapped the dashboard twice. The screen lit up, running on a secure FBI channel that bypassed public servers. He entered his credentials without looking, then turned off the cabin lights so only the screen glowed. A private feed loaded from inside the courthouse, internal camera footage from multiple angles. Not a single second had been scrubbed yet. Not a single hand had touched the servers to alter the narrative. He found the timestamp, the slap, rewound it, watched it again. Angle 1, Brant's hand cutting sideways, the blur of motion impossible to misinterpret. Angle 2, Luther's head snapping to the right, glasses knocked askew, blood blooming from his lower lip. Angle 3, a close-up of Brent's expression just before the strike, something twisted, ugly, a flash of pleasure masquerading as righteousness. Marcus paused the footage on Brent's face. He zoomed in. Frame by frame, his pupils were dilated. No fear, no regret, just heat, satisfaction, power without consequence. That was the real trigger, not the slap, not even the blood, but the look of someone who had done this before and had always walked away. Marcus didn't blink. He reached for the earpiece clipped to the visor, placed it in his ear, and tapped twice. A beep confirmed a secure connection. No introduction, just one phrase. Activate subject Brent Rollins. Tier A3, monitoring, real-time behavior surveillance, retroactive file integration. The voice on the other end replied without hesitation. Confirmed. Authority, Agent Marcus Rowe, Level 6 clearance. Code ID, Delta, November 7. A pause. Proceeding. The line went dead. Marcus leaned back, fingers tapping once against the steering wheel, a slow cadence of bone against leather. His father had bled, not just today. Long before this, Marcus had seen bruises once, decades ago. His father never explained, but Marcus didn't need the story. He knew the world too well. Brent Rollins wasn't the disease. He was a symptom, a swollen boil on a system that had grown used to covering its sores. And now the system had struck the wrong man in front of the wrong witness. Not the crowd, not the cameras, him. Brent might have thought he slapped an old man and walked away, but he didn't slap an old man. He slapped Marcus Rowe's father, and Marcus Rowe was many things. Disciplined, controlled, silent, but most of all he was relentless. Back inside the courthouse, the tension faded like it always did. The judge called the next name on the docket. Lawyers shuffled their papers, eager to make up for lost time. The air resumed its dull hum of bureaucracy. Brent Rollins smirked again, now back in his seat, arms folded, jaw tilted like a man convinced he'd won something no one else could see. And Luther? Luther didn't leave, not right away. He stood there, the blood on his lip drying now, the handkerchief still in his palm, gently folding it once, then twice, then into a neat square. He placed it in his coat pocket, the same pocket where he used to keep church programs or notes to his wife before she passed. He didn't look at Brent, didn't grant him that dignity. He looked at the judge, then slowly turned his eyes to the gallery, not at the people, but through them. He wasn't checking for support. He was checking for witnesses who watched, who did nothing, who turned away. No judgment, just memory. The only thing sharper than pain was memory. He walked out slowly, not like a man defeated, but like a man who had carried this weight before and had no illusions about how long it might last. Outside, Marcus watched his father descend the steps. He didn't step out of the car, didn't wave, didn't draw attention. He just watched, then turned the key in the ignition and pulled away from the curb, already knowing what needed to happen next. In his world, consequences weren't about speed, they were about precision. Inside, Brent cracked his knuckles and chuckled under his breath. He had no idea he'd just triggered a federal blade. No idea the slap he'd thrown would echo farther than the courtroom, faster than social media, deeper than headlines. No idea that the blood on a pair of glasses would soon be under a microscope held by the one person in this country who had the tools, the authority, and, most dangerous of all, the personal reason to burn down everything Brent thought would protect him. The system didn't break today, but it blinked, and Marcus Rowe had already begun to open his eyes. The wheels of the system kept turning, but something beneath them had cracked. As the door of the courtroom closed behind Luther Rowe, a silence still hung like smoke, thin, choking, and impossible to wave away. Brent Rollins, with a jaw clenched in self-satisfaction and eyes still carrying the echo of dominance, stood a moment longer than necessary, savoring his scene. But behind him, the air had changed, not in volume, but in weight. Luther didn't chase the moment. He didn't turn to spit a word or raise a hand. Instead, he did something far more devastating. He acknowledged nothing. He merely nodded. A small gesture, but sharp as a blade. Not to Brent, but to himself, to a code deeper than anger. The tilt of his chin was exact, proud, but not showy. He adjusted his collar with the precision of a man raised in decades where dignity had to be pressed sharp, like Sunday clothes, and worn like armor. There was blood at the corner of his mouth, still. It trailed from the lip to the edge of his chin, not in a streak, but a single focused drop. He unfolded the same handkerchief he had used before, white, worn, no frills, and dabbed the wound once, then again, with calm purpose. His eyes never left Brent. And that stare, quiet, unmoved, still, carried a weight Brent couldn't mock, but he tried. The cop snorted, loud enough to reclaim attention, then turned his back with a grunt that wasn't quite a laugh. "You're lucky, old man," he hissed, not turning his head. "Lucky I didn't squeeze the damn trigger." The words dripped with venom, dressed in a tone halfway between warning and insult, the kind that only makes sense when spoken by a man too used to power without consequence. His voice was sharp, metallic, designed to cut, but Luther gave no response. No wince, no flinch, just a final press of the cloth against his lip before folding it again with care. It was not defiance in the traditional sense. It was worse. It was indifference. Brent didn't get what he wanted. Not fear, not shame, not even pain he could measure, just silence. And silence, for men like him, was the loudest rejection of all. At the back of the courtroom, a chair creaked, just enough to draw no notice, but speak volumes to anyone who listened. Marcus Rowe hadn't moved much since sitting down, but now his hand shifted. His fingers wrapped tighter around the edge of the wooden seat until the knuckles turned bone white. The veins on the back of his hand rose with pressure, like old wires under a sheet of steel. His face didn't move, his jaw didn't clench, his eyes didn't blink, but that hand, that one simple hand, spoke more clearly than a scream ever could. His thumb flexed slowly against the edge, skin tightening over the tendon. Not enough to make a sound, but just enough to say, "I felt that." Across the room, a low murmur was drowned by the sound of a staffer walking briskly to the bench. She held a tablet in her hand, her brows furrowed as she tapped quickly, urgently. She wasn't part of the courtroom staff. She belonged to internal affairs, a presence usually ignored until paperwork needed stamping. But now, something in her step was different. She moved with the kind of speed bureaucrats reserved for accidents, lawsuits, or the kind of trouble that couldn't be filed away in triplicate. She showed the screen to a deputy judge. No words were exchanged, but their faces twitched in unison. The judge glanced toward the internal monitor near the side bench, a rarely used security screen wired directly to courthouse surveillance. Within seconds, the video flickered to life. It showed a timestamp, 10:07 a.m., a still frame, Brent Rollins with his head mid-air. The next frame, Luther's head turned, blood suspended like paint from a flicked brush. No audio, no ambiguity. They ran it again and again. Each time the angle changed. Another camera, another damning confirmation. Brent didn't push, he struck. And he did so with full knowledge that cameras watched him. No flinch, no hesitation. His hand moved like a man who had rehearsed the gesture more times than he'd ever admit. Marcus didn't need to see the footage. He already had. From the back row, his eyes scanned the reactions of those who did. No one said anything. No one dared. But the video didn't need witnesses. The truth, in its purest and ugliest form, had already started speaking. It didn't scream. It whispered, tight, cruel, and final. Luther adjusted the sleeves of his coat. It was an old habit. As if to remind himself that his hands still worked, that his body still answered to him, not the world that tried to break it, he didn't ask for anything. No justice, no apology, not even an acknowledgement from the system that had just swallowed his pain in silence. He turned slowly and walked away, not in shame, not even in quiet triumph, but in something deeper, a kind of peace that only men who've outlived generations of oppression can carry. That walk said, "I've seen worse, but I won't see it again without an answer." Brent rolled his shoulders, muttering to himself, glancing over once more like a schoolyard bully trying to convince himself the punch had landed, but no one met his gaze. Not the clerk, not the judge, not even the staffer who had brought the tablet. He was alone in his smirk now, and for the first time, it didn't sit right. Marcus exhaled slowly, not relief, containment. His body was still, but his hand had finally released the edge of the chair. The pressure left a faint imprint in the wood, shallow, temporary, but enough to prove he'd been there. He stood, wordless, and followed his father's path out of the room, not closing the door behind him. It swung gently on its hinges, creaking like it had more to say, but had forgotten how. Outside, the sky had turned a flatter shade of blue. There was no breeze, just stillness. And behind that stillness, the system had started to sweat. The silence had already done its work. Marcus didn't carry it with him out of the courthouse. It clung to him like a second skin, silent but suffocating, as he walked toward his car without haste. There was no tremble in his step, no flicker in his eyes, just the steady rhythm of a man moving through a world he understood too well. The moment the door of the black sedan clicked shut behind him, everything else ceased to matter. The air inside was cooler, not from the air conditioning, but from control. He didn't pause, didn't sit to think. He tapped the ignition on and the dashboard lit up like an awakening. Fingers moved with instinct, entering encrypted credentials into a panel that looked ordinary to anyone who didn't know better. But nothing about Marcus Rowe was ordinary. Not the way he moved, not the way he watched, and certainly not the way he gathered truth. Like a blade gathers light, the interface blinked to life with quiet clarity. He selected a secure channel, internal FBI mainframe, black level clearance, and entered Brent Rollins' name. Instantly, the screen responded with a list, 7 complaints, not suggestions, complaints, official, recorded, repeated. Marcus didn't blink. He read in silence as though scanning a battlefield for landmines. 3 ethics investigations, none resolved, 1 sealed case, flagged as externally closed. That was the line that made his eyes narrow by a fraction, just enough to let the shadows in. He tapped it. Access denied, clearance mismatch. He didn't try again. He simply opened a separate console and began playback of the courtroom surveillance. No sound, just video. He didn't need words. He never did. The timeline glided beneath his fingertips as he dragged the cursor backward to the moment that mattered. The slap, frame by frame, he watched it unfold. Brent Rollins, uniform stiff with arrogance, stepped forward. Luther Rowe, standing, spine proud. The hand moved. The blood flew, but Marcus didn't watch the impact. He focused on the face. Brent's face, zoomed. There, frozen in a split second, was everything. A flicker in the eyes, not rage, not duty, delight. A kind of twisted satisfaction that only comes from someone who believes they've just reminded the world who's in charge. There was no calculation in Brent's expression, no hesitation, just joy. Like the act of violence had scratched an itch in his soul. Marcus paused the video on that frame. The eyes were slightly wide, the mouth a fraction twisted, not with regret, but with release. Brent Rollins didn't act in the heat of the moment. He indulged in it. He performed. That wasn't a man on the edge. That was a man in control. And that was the danger. Marcus leaned back, shoulders calm, body still as a statue carved from a colder world. He raised the embedded microphone by the steering column and spoke in a tone that didn't rise above conversation but carried the finality of a verdict. "Activate behavioral tracking for subject Brent Rollins," he said. "Authorization, Rowe, Marcus. Level 6, Protocol A3. The confirmation tone was immediate. Subject flagged. Tier A3 surveillance initiated. He didn't thank the system. He didn't nod. His eyes were already returning to the sealed case file. His fingers hovered, then entered a personal override code. His own, tied to internal affairs access. Denied. He didn't flinch. Just noted the resistance. Everything about Brent's file stank of insulation. Years of complaints, patterns hidden behind badges, violence disguised as policing, and now a sealed report marked by an external closure, which in bureau speak often meant someone bigger had buried something smaller. Marcus stared at the word closed, as if willing it to bleed. Outside, the world went on. Cars passed, birds flew. Somewhere down the street, a child was laughing. But inside this car, inside this sealed pocket of logic and memory, Marcus was already sharpening his mind into a weapon. He didn't rage. He didn't speak another word. But his next move was already forming, precise and cold. He tapped the file one more time and downloaded the metadata. 10 masters, logins, revision authors. No names appeared, just encrypted IDs. But Marcus knew how to unmask them when it was time. He always did, because knowing was never the problem. Proving it, that was the art. He returned to Brent's complaints, each one marked unsubstantiated. But beneath that, one line repeated, witness retracted, complainant unavailable, evidence inconclusive. It wasn't incompetent, it was protection. Marcus pulled up a full report log of Brent's internal activity. Access requests, location pings, personnel interactions. In 1 week alone, Brent had pinged 3 internal databases that had nothing to do with patrol duties. One was a social services record. Another was a hospital intake report. The third was a sealed juvenile file. That's not just a pattern, as a roadmap, and Brent had been driving it for years. Marcus shifted in his seat and exhaled once, not from exertion, but calculation. His hand opened, then closed again, the knuckles pale, the wrist still. Nothing about his expression changed. But if someone had been watching, really watching, they would have seen it. The pressure was rising. He minimized the report and replayed the video one last time. This time, He didn't look at Brent. He looked at his father. Luther had absorbed the slap like a wall absorbs impact, firm, unmoved, without giving anything back. And that stillness, that refusal to be broken, had ignited something in Marcus. Brent thought he'd put a man down. Instead, he'd activated the only man in the room who didn't need a badge to bring the roof down. Marcus closed the interface. The screen went black, but the silence didn't return. It had already changed into intent. He turned the key, not to leave, but to begin. And Brent Rollins, wherever he was at that moment, had no idea that the man he didn't look at in the courtroom was already watching him from angles he couldn't see. Brent had believed he was safe, but Marcus Rowe was not a threat. He was a consequence. The hum of the engine faded as Marcus pulled into the narrow driveway of the old brick house. It was unremarkable, like 100 others on the block, modest, worn, but dignified, the kind of place that didn't ask for attention, but had earned its place in the world 1 year, one quiet act of endurance at a time. The porch light was off. No need for it. His father had always said, "A home doesn't need to shine. It just needs to hold." Marcus turned off the ignition and stepped into the silence. The air smelled faintly of dust, leather, and old wood, like a room where history was shelved but never forgotten. He didn't knock. He didn't need to. The door was unlocked, the way it had always been for him and no one else. Inside, the house was dim but not dark. The curtains were drawn, but a single lamp glowed in the corner, casting a warm light over the shelves, the old chessboard still set mid-game, and the photographs arranged with almost military precision. Luther was already seated at the small dining table, back straight, hands resting palm down, a stillness in him that felt almost ceremonial. He didn't look up when Marcus entered. He didn't need to. The only sound was the slow creak of a drawer opening. Luther reached into the cabinet beside him and pulled out a photograph, aged, corners curled, edges faded but not torn. He held it without reverence, without trembling, just a steady hand used to carrying the weight of the past. In the photo, a younger version of him stood in the middle of a crowd, flanked by a black minister in a dark suit and a group of men and women holding handmade signs. 1967. The sidewalk was sun-bleached. The expressions were firm, eyes forward, mouths closed. Peaceful protest, dangerous defiance. The kind of image that never made headlines but changed something underneath. Luther stared at it for a long second. Then he placed it on the table, not as a memory, but as evidence. "That wasn't the first slap," he said, voice low, even, like a man recalling the weather. "But it's the first one you've seen." Marcus stood across from him, silent. His coat was still on. His hands were in his pockets. The weight in the room didn't come from volume. It came from knowing. Luther didn't look up. He didn't need to. There was one outside a voting booth, another outside a church, once by a cop who called me boy in front of your mother. His fingers hovered over the photograph, but didn't touch it again. And I took them all the same way I took this one. Not because I'm soft, but because I needed to stay on my feet. Marcus didn't speak. He didn't move. His stillness wasn't passive, it was coiled. Luther finally looked at his son, eyes not watery with emotion, but sharp with clarity. "You asked me once why I never fought back," he said. "It wasn't that I couldn't. I just knew who I was fighting." Marcus's jaw didn't clench, but something in his shoulder shifted, like tension cracking beneath a stone facade. His eyes flicked once to the photograph, then to his father's hand resting near it. The skin was darker now, the veins raised, the fingers knotted with age, but the grip was still there, not tight, just ready. "What do you want?" Marcus asked. It's not like a question, more like a condition. Luther didn't hesitate. "Not revenge," he said. "Closure." Marcus waited. Luther leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table, fingers clasped. "This isn't about Brent Rollins. He's just a name. They come and go, uniforms change, but hands stay the same. I don't want a headline. I don't want an apology. I want it to stop." His voice never rose, not even a degree. "I want you to make it stop." Marcus didn't nod, didn't blink. He just breathed once, deeply, like something internal had aligned. Luther watched him carefully. "I know what you can do," the old man said. "I also know what it'll cost." There was no reply, no promise. Marcus simply reached out, picked up the photograph, and studied it, not as a son, not as an agent, as a ledger, a record, a claim left unpaid. The moment lingered, not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. Luther stood and stepped away, slow, deliberate. "I'm going to bed," he said. "Don't stay too long in the past. That's where they want you." Marcus remained alone in the room. He held the photo for a beat longer, then folded it once carefully and slid it into his coat pocket, as if storing it not as memory, but as mission. He didn't smile. He didn't mourn. He turned and left the house like the man he had always been, but this time carrying something heavier than a badge. This time, he wasn't just bearing witness, he was going to answer, and the silence behind him spoke louder than any permission. The silence in Marcus's apartment was thick, unbroken, pulsing like the hum of a machine just before it roars to life. His father's words still echoed beneath his skull. Not revenge, resolution. It wasn't a plea, it was a directive, handed down like a legacy forged in bruises and dignity. And so, as night folded over D.C., Marcus Rose sat before the flickering screen of his secure terminal, a single hand poised over the keyboard, and opened the personnel file of Brent Rollin. The data unfolded like a wound peeling back. Line after line of incidents are buried in bureaucratic smoke. 7 formal complaints filed under Brent's name, each one a bullet point in a system designed to protect the man holding the gun rather than the one bleeding from its use. The cursor hovered over the first case, a construction worker, 42, spine shattered during an arrest involving non-compliance and necessary force. The incident report used the phrase 3 times, as if repetition could justify paralysis. Marcus didn't flinch. He simply highlighted the name in red. Next, a high school student, 17, brought in for suspicion of theft. Hours of unrecorded interrogation. Found dead in his home a week later. Suicide. No apology, no internal review. Brandt's statement had been brief. Kid couldn't handle pressure. World's better off. Marcus marked the name in red, lips a tight line, fingers moving with surgical steadiness. He didn't blink. Nurse, mid-30s, reported Rollins for harassment during a traffic stop. Her complaint noted the phrase, "You know you like a man in uniform," followed by unwanted touching and threats, dismissed due to insufficient evidence. The phrase struck like acid on steel. Marcus clicked red again. He moved on. A petty thief shot in the leg while running. The bullet tore through femoral tissue, leaving the man unable to walk without assistance for the rest of his life. The dash cam was mysteriously corrupted that night. Brandt's only explanation. If he didn't want to get shot, maybe don't run. Red, a woman, homeless, was assaulted behind a diner. Brent was first on the scene. When asked why there were bruises not consistent with the attacker's profile, his internal memo simply read, "She was hysterical, needed calming down." There were no follow-ups. Marcus didn't hesitate. Another red name. Another case, an undocumented worker. His jaw was broken in 3 places during what Brent called verbal resistance. The man didn't speak English. Brent's comment in the report, "He understands pain just fine." Marcus tapped the keyboard, read. The final file was different. A young man, mid-20s, detained after a protest. No body cam footage. The man's complaint was heavy with details. Strangulation, verbal abuse, a racial slur carved into the bathroom stall where he was kept overnight. The file ended abruptly. Status closed. External interference. No signature, no further explanation. Marcus paused. His eyes locked on the phrase, external interference. He isolated the line and boxed it in digital yellow. He clicked the security level tab. A prompt appeared. High sensitivity file. Clearance required. Marcus entered his override code, row A7X13, and confirmed. The screen flickered for half a second, then loaded a new tier of data. Blacked out names, timestamps, evidence strings removed, internal communications redacted by higher-ups. But there, beneath the blackout lines, something bled through. A voice transcript flagged, non-replicable. Brandt's words, "That little bitch should have known better. I didn't break him. I been him till he snapped himself." The voice was unmistakable, cold, proud, like bruises spoken out loud. Marcus leaned back for a moment. The room felt colder, not from temperature, but from the pure, mechanical weight of rot. These weren't outliers. They were a pattern. Brant Rollins wasn't a mistake in the system. He was what the system allowed when no one paid attention, when fear spoke louder than facts, when brown bodies meant less than blue uniforms. Marcus's jaw flexed as he toggled back through the files, each red name a testimony of pain buried in administrative decay. He opened a secondary window, typed a command into the behavioral profiling matrix. Input: Rollins, Brant. 7 flags, 3 ethical violations, 1 closed file with elevated sensitivity. Marcus added his notes. Pattern consistent with systemic cover behavior. The subject displays premeditated cruelty and an immunity complex, recommending psychological deconstruction. He didn't use the word monster. Monsters weren't coddled by pensions and protocol. Monsters didn't smile in badge photos. The system chimed softly. His command input had triggered a Level 2 review. A new prompt flashed. "This action will notify the Oversight Division. Continue," Marcus confirmed. Across the screen, a small detail caught his eye. 10 secs from Brent's personnel evaluations. Every year, the same supervisors signed off. Each report contained a phrase eerily consistent. "Good instincts, asserted under pressure, maintains authority." Marcus copied the phrase, pasted it into a side file, and wrote beneath it, "They called it instinct. Victims called it survival." His fingers moved without hesitation. Every name he'd marked red was added to a single list, not a manifesto, not a threat, a ledger of pain, silenced voices, and one man who thought he was the storm itself. Brent Rollins didn't make mistakes. He made examples, and Marcus wasn't interested in philosophy or fury. He was interested in facts, and what those facts could do when stacked high enough to smother a legacy built on bruises. A soft knock echoed at his door. Routine clearance check. He ignored it. He toggled one final tab. The system's AI assistant chirped. "Warning, cumulative severity index exceeds 5.4. Subject meets criteria for priority monitoring." The number glowed red. Marcus added one word beneath it: escalate. As the screen dimmed to standby, Marcus didn't sigh, didn't crack his knuckles or stretch like the scene called for a release of tension. There was no release. Not yet. His mind stayed locked on that last victim. The closed file, the external interference. Someone had stepped in, someone with weight, access, and intent. And Brent, the man who laughed while others bled, had been protected, not in shadows, but behind paperwork. Marcus stood, silently, not to rest, not to react, but to act. He didn't need applause. He needed proof, and this was just the beginning. The glow of the monitor still burned in Marcus's mind as he drove into the outer rim of Prince George's County, where the city faded into fractured silence and abandoned gas stations stood like ghosts, outposts of a world long gone. The sky was a dull gray, the kind of colorless ceiling that pressed down on everything beneath it. He didn't check the time. He didn't need to. This wasn't a meeting. It was a calculation, a risk measured in truths too dangerous to be archived. The location was specific: Gasway 13. Mile marker 274, an old fueling station swallowed by dust, plywood, and weeds. No lights, no signs, just a faded neon "open" that flickered like it was trying to remember its purpose. Marcus pulled in without cutting the engine. His eyes scanned the perimeter. No cameras, no other vehicles. She'd picked the place well. She was already there, seated on the concrete step beside the vending machine that hadn't worked since the Obama administration. Her hoodie was pulled low, and she looked smaller than she had in the photo embedded in her old personnel file. Administrative Coordinator, Internal Affairs, name redacted post-resignation. But her eyes, when she looked up, were sharp. Not afraid, not defiant, just tired. Marcus exited the vehicle slowly, his steps deliberate, weightless, no badge showing, no weapon drawn. They They didn't shake hands. There was no need. "You came alone?" she said. Her voice was husky, not from fear, but from disuse, like the truth that had gone too long unspoken. "I always do," Marcus replied. He didn't smile. She nodded once, then reached into her coat and pulled out a small, scratched USB drive wrapped in black tape. She didn't hold it out like an offering, more like a warning. "This is the only copy," she said. "I wiped my drive. I used a ghost VPN. I even smashed the original laptop. If I get audited, I wasn't there." Marcus took the USB without touching her hand. "You filed a complaint 3 years ago." "They buried it," she said flatly. He laughed about it in the elevator the next day. Said, "Ain't nobody coming for me. I'm the dog they let off the leash." Marcus didn't blink. He plugged the drive into a pocket reader on his phone and tapped to open the audio file. The sound was rough, distorted slightly by the poor acoustics of what sounded like a break room or locker area. A laugh came first, dry, smug, and unmistakable. Then Brent's voice, sharp and slow, as if savoring each word, like a brand being pressed into flesh. "I just nudged him. One kick, that weak ass folded like a lawn chair. If he died, that's on him. I don't kill people. I just remind them they ain't built for the world." There was a pause in the audio, then another voice, a chuckle, maybe a colleague, but nothing intelligible. The recording cut off. Marcus ejected the drive, placed it in a sealed case, and looked back at the woman. "How am I now?" he asked. She didn't fidget. She didn't look away. She just exhaled, like someone dragging something heavy out of their lungs. "Because I saw what happened in that courtroom. You didn't flinch. Everyone else did, even the judge, but not you." He didn't confirm or deny. She went on. "You weren't shocked. You were waiting, like it wasn't new, like it was just the moment when everything cracked open." Marcus nodded, slow and deliberate. "It was." She pulled the hoodie tighter, eyes scanning the empty lot like the ghosts of what she'd seen might still be watching. "You're not like the others," she said. "They all file reports and wait for permission. You're not asking anyone to say yes." "I don't need yes," Marcus said, voice low, steady. "I need proof." "You've got it," she said. "But this isn't going to bring him down by itself. That recording's ugly. But it's not a policy violation. It's just rot. Rot in his voice. Rot they'll pretend is locker room talk if they want to." Marcus's eyes didn't shift. "Then I'll give them a corpse count to match the stench," she snorted. It wasn't humor. It was an agreement. You're either going to end him or go down with the whole ceiling collapsing on your head. I'll take either, as long as he doesn't walk away. Silence stretched between them like a wire drawn taut. The gas station hummed quietly, as if even the insects were holding their breath. She stood. "You never asked my name." "I already know it." "Then use it only if I disappear." She started walking back toward the woods that lined the highway, her steps light, deliberate. She didn't look back. Marcus watched her go, then returned to the car, dropped the USB into a secondary shielded drive, and powered up the secure data sync. The system's response blinked fast. Audio file received, transcription in progress. He stared out the windshield, the silence around him humming louder than engines ever could. In that recording, Brent had finally revealed the thread that connected all the cases. Not just brutality, but contempt. Not just harm, but amusement. And above all, confidence. Confidence that no matter how deep he pushed, the walls would never close in. Marcus knew better now. The walls were moving. He was making sure of it. He tapped into a secure line to the Behavioral Ethics Board, submitted the audio as evidence under priority review, and flagged it for analysis under Category X, patterns of dereliction with social dehumanization language. Not many knew the code existed. Fewer had clearance to use it. But Marcus Rowe had clearance. And intent. The screen glitched for half a second as the system rerouted through encrypted cloud protocols. Then the confirmation came in. Received. Validated. Composite pattern risk escalated to level orange. Orange wasn't red, but it was one shade away. Marcus closed the terminal, leaned back into his seat, and let the weight of the night settle onto his spine like armor being fastened. There were no more ghosts to chase, only predators, and Marcus Rowe had just pulled the leash, from the last man who thought he couldn't be caged. The system flagged the audio within minutes, not for profanity, not even for brutality. It was flagged for tone, gleegi, the kind of joy a predator leaks when it knows the walls won't touch it. Marcus didn't wait for the analysis. He had what he needed. The sound of Brent Rollins not just confessing, boasting, and behind every boastful man in uniform there was always a shadow, in a robe, making sure the lights never reached too deep. Marcus moved quickly, bypassing internal bureaucracy like a scalpel skipping skin. He dialed the direct line of the federal oversight. The man who answered wasn't just a colleague, he was a gatekeeper. Thomas Laird, Chief Federal Inspector, voice crisp as gravel under a boot. No hellos, just recognition. "You have something, don't you?" Marcus replied, calm as steel before the cut. "Brent Rollins." And the judge who made him bulletproof. Laird didn't ask for an explanation. He rerouted a secure channel, patched into the integrated surveillance log, and granted Marcus elevated clearance to retrieve encrypted judicial contact records. Within 30 seconds, Marcus had it. 2 call logs between Brent Rollins and Judge Edwin Reed, both made late at night, both lasting under a minute. One just days before a misconduct complaint was administratively retired. The other, 1 hour before the case file involving the protester with the carved stall was locked under irrelevant evidence protocol. He ran voice match queries against known samples. The metadata returned near-perfect alignment, Reed's voice, verified in 6 syllables on a judicial voicemail. The contact number was marked personal. Marcus didn't need more, but he wanted precision. So he sent Laird the audio file. Brent, again full of spite and acid, in that same smirk-drenched cadence. "Reed always covers for me. I drop names, he drops hammers. That's our game." The silence on the line with Laird was telling. No hesitation, "Are you prepared to confront a federal judge, Marcus?" Marcus's voice dropped, not in tone, but in temperature. "I'm prepared to remove the rotten beam holding up the facade." The meeting was arranged. Within 2 hours. No press, no subpoenas, no headlines, just one room, soundproofed, deep inside the Oversight Division's subterranean wing. A conference table, no windows, one door. Judge Edwin Reed arrived exactly on time, wearing a suit that cost more than a year of rent in Southeast D.C., tie knotted so tight it could have held his alibi together. His eyes were the kind of gray that tried to convince you they'd seen everything and forgotten nothing. He walked in with the gait of a man who'd silenced more voices than he could count. Marcus didn't stand. Power didn't rise to greet privilege. It waited for it to crack. "Agent Rowe," Reed said smoothly, dropping his briefcase with a leather snap. "I understand there's been some misunderstanding." Marcus placed the audio recorder gently on the table, the small red light already blinking. He slid a transcript across like a razor laid bare. "Brent Rollins, 2 calls traced to your number, 2 case closures immediately after, both in his favor." Reed didn't blink. "I receive hundreds of calls. Some of the numbers I don't recognize. Are we assuming guilt by association now?" "No." Marcus tapped the transcript. "We're assuming the cause of the confession." He pressed play. Brant's voice filled the room, slick with swagger. "Reed always covers for me." Reed's mouth tightened, just slightly. A muscle in his jaw ticked like a clock marking down to implosion. He reached for the paper with perfectly calm hands, scanned it, then chuckled, a brittle sound. "This is hardly admissible. Locker room talk from a deluded subordinate. If we started arresting people for exaggeration, we'd have to close Congress." Marcus didn't move. "No one's talking about arresting you. Not yet." "Oh?" Reed leaned back, eyes narrowing. "Then what is this, Agent Rowe? An intimidation stunt? You're in a room with a sitting federal judge?" "I'm in a room with a man who left a door unlocked for a monster," Marcus said, voice calm, unwavering. "And now I'm asking why." Reed didn't laugh this time. His composure cracked, not shattered, just hairline fractures forming beneath a frozen surface. "I didn't tell him to break the law," he said. But you made sure no one could prove it when he did, Marcus replied, each word measured like a bullet in a clip. You didn't get your hands dirty. You just made sure there was a towel waiting when his hands were covered in blood. Reed stood, the color draining slightly from his face. Not fear, rage, held on a leash. You don't know how this works, Roe. People like Rawlins are necessary. Men who aren't afraid to do the hard things. Marcus stood too, cutting through the air like a blade finally unsheathed. Hard things don't include crushing spines, silencing victims, or laughing over corpses. That's not courage, that's rot. And you made space for it to grow. The judge's face turned pale, then pink, then white again, an entire spectrum of exposure in under 10 seconds. He opened his mouth, but the words didn't come. Not right away, not coherently. I never signed anything. No direct orders. Nothing that can tie. You gave him belief, Marcus interrupted, and that was more dangerous than permission. For a moment, the room held its breath. The blinking recorder light cast a soft, infernal glow on the table. Reed's hands trembled, just slightly, as he picked up his briefcase. His voice, when he spoke again, had lost the velvet. All that remained was chalk. You'll regret this, Agent Rowe. Men like you burn bright, but you don't last. Marcus didn't blink. Men like me don't need to last. We just need to burn long enough to reveal what's crawling underneath. Reed left. His steps were fast but not hurried, controlled but not calm. The kind of walk a man took when he knew the spotlight was behind him and the shadow was catching up. When the door clicked shut, Laird stepped out from the observation room. We've got him. Marcus didn't nod. He just turned off the recorder, stood, and walked out. No celebration, no vindication, just the cold clarity of progress. The network wasn't just Brent. It was everyone who looked the other way, who shook hands behind closed doors, who called monsters useful because they bled for the right side of the badge. Reed was one of many, but now he was the first to crack, and Marcus had only just begun. The door to power doesn't always creak. Sometimes clicks. Quiet, deliberate, final. As Marcus left the oversight chamber, the last words Judge Reed had choked out still hovered like static. You'll regret this. He didn't. Not for a second. The network had shown its seams, and now it was time to pull the thread. He stepped into the Federal Criminal Prosecution Office without announcement. No press, no ceremony, just a sealed case file in his left hand and a blood-stamped legacy burning in the other. The receptionist at the front recognized his badge, but it wasn't the medal she reacted to. It was the look. A man passed every moral checkpoint, moving only with purpose. The assistant DA greeted him within minutes, a woman whose eyes had read more sealed testimonies than newspaper headlines. You came fast, she said. I move when the system stalls. He placed the case file on her desk, each page already indexed, logged, and signed. Audio recordings, phone logs, suppressed complaints, judicial interference, a digital index drive containing every red-marked name he had filed, evidence, not stories. She scanned the cover sheet. Brent Rawlins, 12-year decorated officer, 7 complaints, 2 deaths, 1 protector. This is going federal? She asked. Marcus nodded. He's not a local problem. He's a systemic one. The assistant DA didn't argue. She read the headers of each page like reading a sentence in motion. Her brow furrowed once, then twice, then smoothed, not from surprise, but from calculation. She reached for the terminal, input his agent ID, ran it against the federal motion queue, and said only, "It's going to require level 1 clearance to push this through." "I have it," Marcus replied, already producing the digital clearance token. His face remained impassive, his body still, like a statue wired to explode only when the trigger was just. The system verified him in under 7 seconds. A green light pulsed on the console. The request is eligible for priority federal prosecution. The assistant DA pulled up the template for a Title 18 violation, abuse of authority under federal color of law. The charges nested within it carried more than jail time. They rewrote reputations. She didn't type. She let him. Marcus sat down, inputting each clause manually. Aggravated use of force, coercion of testimony, evidence suppression, complicity by the judiciary. Each line typed clean, surgical, and unflinching, like a report written not in ink but in scar tissue. The system prompted, issue an arrest warrant. He didn't hesitate. The room, though climate-controlled, suddenly felt colder. Marcus entered the final command, authorized by his badge number, and watched as the system generated the document in real time. Brent Rawlins' name appeared in bold, followed by the line, "To be taken into federal custody without notification to local precinct. High-risk profile. No warning required." The assistant DA handed him the warrant. Her fingers brushed his for half a second. "You're signing the fall of someone the system's been protecting for over a decade." Marcus took the pen. His grip didn't waver. His voice didn't shake. "I've been ready since the moment he called my father garbage." The signature landed like a bullet, not loud, but irreversible. Ink against paper, a system against the abuser, legacy against rot. One of his colleagues entered the office just as the seal was affixed. He was young, sharp, and still had idealism in his walk. "You doing this?" he asked, eyes wide. Marcus stood, held up the document, eyes calm as a loaded trigger. "This isn't a choice. It's overdue. You're going after a cop, a white cop, with federal teeth." "I'm going after a man who thought pain was his currency," Marcus said. "I'm just making the transaction official." No one clapped. No one offered a salute. There was no music swelling in the background, just silence and the hum of legal machinery shifting into gear. Marcus turned and left with the warrant in hand. His steps echoed down the marble hallway like a countdown in reverse, the kind that didn't end in a bang, but in a door knocked down before sunrise. And somewhere, Brent Rawlins kept walking the streets, smug and shielded, never suspecting that the paper trail he'd pissed on was now the rope tightening around his career, his shield, his mouth. Marcus didn't need thunder. He had the law, and it had just grown teeth. The signature had barely dried on the federal arrest warrant when the real detonation happened, not in a courtroom, not in a press release, but online, where control was a myth and exposure moved faster than law. The clip wasn't new, but the context had changed. It surfaced first on Reddit, uploaded by someone sitting in the back row of the Winston Hill courtroom, frame shaky but clear enough. Brent Rawlins, towering in uniform, reaching out with contempt carved into every wrinkle of his sneer, delivering a slap that echoed louder than any gavel ever had. The victim, a 72-year-old black man with blood dripping from the bridge of his nose onto silver-framed glasses. That image, visceral, unblinking, was the matchstick. The fire didn't wait. Within hours, the clip jumped from subreddit threads into TikTok edits, laced with audio clips of protest anthems, sharp jump cuts, and angry overlays. The slap was slowed, looped, and cut with headlines about excessive force and systemic protection. Twitter erupted next. The hashtag trended, not slowly, but like a punch through glass. "You slapped the wrong man." It wasn't just a phrase, it was an indictment. Users dragged out older footage. Brent smiling at award ceremonies. Brent in press conferences. Brent gripping a rifle with swagger. Then came the comparison, a viral split image. On the left, Brent, frozen mid-sneer, hand still raised like a hammer in search of approval. On the right, Luther Rowe, bloodied but upright, his eyes locked on nothing and everything at once. He didn't speak, he didn't move. That stillness carried weight. Comment sections exploded. Anger came first, raw, unfiltered, global. But then came something colder, sharper, satire. One meme paired Brent's image with the phrase, serving and protecting his ego. Another showed Luther's face with the caption, "He didn't flinch, but you should've." But it was one comment, short, buried under thousands, that cut deepest. Reposted, screenshotted, turned into merch, it read, "He didn't scream, but his son could make the entire system scream back." 24 hours later, it had 5 million likes. Marcus wasn't tagged, he wasn't named, but the algorithm didn't care. Clips of him walking into federal buildings surfaced. Threads dissected his body language, his silence, the tension in his jaw. "This guy moves like a storm is overdue," one tweet said. Another, "You know he's dangerous because he hasn't said a single thing to the press." And he didn't. While social media spun like a storm, Marcus kept moving through federal channels like a guided missile. But even he couldn't ignore the shift. He didn't need to court attention. The slap had turned into a story, then into a symbol, and now into an avalanche. His inbox filled not with congratulations, but with links, Reddit threads tracking Brent's public appearances, TikTok videos splicing courtroom footage with Kendrick Lamar tracks, Instagram stories where teenagers reenacted the slap in reverse, giving Rollins a taste of poetic justice. Inside the FBI's internal systems, a monitor kept tabs on viral sentiment. Rollins' name triggered 70,000 mentions in under 18 hours. Sentiment analysis, 92% negative, 5% neutral, 3% vaguely unhinged. The hashtag was now the top global trend. Congressional aides were whispering. DD offices were drafting statements. Internal Affairs reopened 2 files they had shelved months ago, not from duty, from pressure. Brent didn't post a thing. His accounts went dark. But silence didn't help. His face had become the meme, the monster, the lesson. People were finding old clips of him mocking suspects, zooming into his eyes, finding arrogance in every blink. They weren't wrong. He looked like a man who believed the rules were jokes he never had to laugh at. Some defenders tried. Thin blue line blogs attempted a spin, calling the footage incomplete and saying context was missing. But screenshots flooded in. Witnesses posted first-hand accounts. "I was there," one said. "I saw the blood before I saw anyone move." Marcus, when briefed, didn't comment. He read everything, not out of vanity, but out of obligation. Every post was proof. Not that Brent was guilty, he already knew that, but that people had seen, and they weren't unseeing this time. He watched the meme slowly morph from Brent versus Luther to something broader. A photo of a gavel with a crack through it. A police badge was half melted. One post showed a chessboard, all white pieces shattered, only one black king left standing. The caption, "Check." That night, a CNN panel debated the clip. One anchor called it a cultural turning point, another called it a digital linchpin for institutional scrutiny. Marcus didn't watch. He sat in his apartment, reading deposition summaries, prepping the next stage. But outside his building, someone had chalked the hashtag on the sidewalk, not sprayed, not screamed, chalked. Quiet, impermanent, yet undeniable. He slapped the wrong man. He looked at it only once, then stepped over it, not out of disrespect, but momentum. He wasn't done. The sidewalk still bore the chalked message. "You slapped the wrong man," when Brent Rollins stepped in front of the podium, eyes defiant, jaw clenched so hard it looked like a mask forged in fury. The press conference wasn't scheduled, it wasn't authorized. But rage rarely waits for permission. His badge still gleamed under the sunlight. His tie was too tight, his tone was venom wrapped in a flag. "This isn't about justice," he barked. "This is a coordinated campaign against law enforcement, against white officers doing their job." Cameras clicked. Reporters blinked. One of them raised a hand for clarification, but Brent didn't pause. His voice sharpened, each word a dagger of self-preservation. "This isn't about misconduct. It's about targeting. I'm not the story here. I'm the scapegoat." In the back, someone murmured, "You slapped a 72-year-old man." Brent heard it. He didn't flinch. He leaned into the mic. "You weren't in that courtroom. You didn't see the threat in his eyes." There it was, the spin, the infection, the reflex of every cornered abuser who mistakes their decay for a war they didn't start. Elsewhere, Marcus Rowe stood behind the tinted glass of the Bureau's media control wing, watching the live stream in silence. A junior agent beside him asked, "Should we respond?" Marcus said nothing. His stillness wasn't absence, it was precision. He watched Brent twist the narrative like a snake eating its tail. He knew what came next, and he didn't need a microphone to make it happen. As the conference ended in a scatter of confused reporters and tightened jaws, a new tremor shook the foundation, not from words, but from a leak. CNN's evening broadcast opened with a red banner. "Break, bleak. Federal email suggests imminent FBI action against Rollins." The screen split. On one side, Brent's press conference footage, frozen mid-sentence. On the other hand, a screenshot of a secured internal email chain, highlighted in yellow. FBI will move in on Brent Rollins. Pre-dawn. Federal scope. No postponement. The internet convulsed. Threads spawned, hashtags renewed. Commentators speculated. Analysts dissected the phrase "no postponement" like it held divine power. On TikTok, users dropped remixes with countdown clocks. "They're coming at dawn" became the new rally cry. Inside his home, Brent saw the broadcast. Not delayed, live. He stared at the screen, unmoving, then slowly reached for his phone. His finger hovered above the dial pad. There was no one left to call. Reed had vanished. His lawyer had gone dark. The department didn't return his last 3 messages. He opened Twitter, saw his name trending beside the words "systemic brutality," then closed the app without blinking. A second later, the device flew across the room, shattering against the far wall, like it had just absorbed every lie he'd ever told. Silence swallowed the room. He stood for a moment, chest heaving, alone in a house where every object felt like an accusation. The framed commendations on his wall looked smaller now. The blue line flag above his liquor cabinet hung limp, dust gathering at its edge. He reached for a bottle, twisted the cap with a shake in his hand, and he hadn't earned it through age. The bourbon hit fast, too fast. His reflection in the glass door stuttered, then settled. Not a hero, not a symbol, just a man whose time had finally caught up. On the table before him sat the document, printed in federal red, stamped with the words "Federal Summons," non-deferrable, immediate compliance required. He hadn't opened it. He didn't need to. The envelope screamed louder than any knock. He poured again, hands looser now, mouth bitter with metal and defeat. For the first time in a long time, Brent didn't have a response ready. The uniform was in the closet. The gun was in a drawer. But neither could answer for what was coming. He looked out the window. The sky was dimming. Still. Too still. Not a breeze, not a bird. Just the air, holding its breath. Tomorrow wasn't theoretical anymore. It had a time, a name, a face. And that face wasn't his. It was the son of the man he slapped. And morning was almost here. Dawn didn't break that morning. It arrived with discipline. No bird song, no golden hue, just a cold slab of gray sky and a convoy of black vehicles gliding down a street that had no idea history was about to bend. Brent Rollins stepped outside his house like he still owned the morning. His jaw hadn't been shaved. His shirt was unbuttoned halfway, sleeves rolled with the forced casualness of a man who thought chaos wouldn't dare knock. He pulled the door shut behind him with one hand and lit a cigarette with the other, squinting into the windless silence, like a king surveying a kingdom he believed too loyal to rebel. He didn't hear the first click. He didn't notice the signal from the lead car, but he heard the boots. A dozen sets, moving as one, fast and focused. He turned, slow at first, then whipped around when the metallic slide of a bolt carrier screamed across the air. He raised both hands, halfway, not in surrender, but in confusion, like the world had gotten its lines wrong. From the front, Marcus emerged. No helmet, no shades, just the black federal jacket with the gold letters across his chest and eyes that burned with nothing but direction. His team flanked him, tight formation, zero chatter. No dramatics, just a purpose. Brent's voice cracked open first. "You can't do this. You don't have jurisdiction." Marcus didn't stop. He raised the document, printed in scarlet, heavy with the authority of every name Rollins had once spat on. "I can. I do. I signed it." Brent's hands curled into fists. His face twisted into a sneer that had gotten him out of every internal hearing for over a decade. "This is bullshit. I'll sue you. I'll sue all of you." He stepped forward, 2 inches too fast. The first agent restrained him, arms locked. Movements are clean, fast, the kind of hold you train for, not improvise. Brent bucked, twisted, spat a curse. Then came the cold snap, the steel of the cuffs wrapping around his wrists, sharp and definitive, followed by the double click of the locking pins. The sound wasn't loud, but it was final. "Get your hands off me," he roared. "I'm a goddamn officer of the law." Marcus stepped in close, voice like a scalpel. "Not today. Today, you're a suspect under federal custody," Brent thrashed again. "This is revenge. You're doing this for your father." Marcus looked him dead in the eye, not a flicker of heat in his tone. "No, this is for everyone who didn't get to speak." Brent's knees buckled slightly as they began walking him to the vehicle. The street remained quiet, neighbors behind blinds. Some phones were raised behind curtains. Nothing loud, just a silence soaked in consequence. As they passed the front gate, Brent turned his head and screamed one last time. "You hear me, Roe? I'll drag you down with me." Marcus didn't slow. He leaned just enough for Brent to hear it over the rumble of engines. "Today," he said softly, "you don't get to yell." The back door of the transport vehicle opened. Brent was pushed inside, the cuffs now digging into wrists that once held a badge like a weapon. The door slammed. The locks clicked again, deep, mechanical, impossible to mistake. Marcus stood at the curb, unmoved, watching the convoy pull away. The air remained still, but power had shifted, and for the first time, Brent Rollins wasn't walking through a door. He was being escorted out of one. The click of the interrogation room door was the only sound Brent Rollins heard for several seconds. Clean, cold, unmistakable. It echoed like a gavel slammed inside concrete. The walls were beige but felt white, like the absence of all color had weight. No lawyer, no witness, just the hum of a recessed camera and the soft red eye of a recorder blinking in rhythm with inevitability. Brent sat in the steel chair, cuffed to the table with a short chain that allowed just enough motion to gesture but not escape. His posture said pride, but his eyes betrayed calculation. The room didn't rattle him, not yet. The opposite chair remained empty for exactly 9 seconds. Then Marcus Rowe walked in. No fanfare, no notes, no escort, just him. Dark suit, clipped steps, and a gaze that didn't ask questions. It documented them. He sat across from Brent, placed a file on the table, and didn't open it. The silence stretched like taut wire. Brent broke it first. Of course he did. No attorney? His smirk was all teeth, all habit. "I thought you feds were big on due process." Marcus pressed the record button. The device beeped once, then locked in. "You waived representation," he said, calm, even, unshaken. Brent leaned back slightly. "I like a fair fight." Marcus tapped a key on the monitor. The screen on the wall lit up. The first video began. A man limping down an alley after an arrest. Brent's voice was audible. "Keep crawling. Maybe you'll learn something." Brent didn't blink. That was edited. Second clip. A woman sobbing during a forced confession. Background voice. "We can do this easily, or we can do it forever." Her eyes were swollen. Brent's face never entered frame. His voice did. Brent shrugged. "I was within protocol." Third file. A nurse's testimony. Grainy footage of a bruised wrist. The audio picked up Brent saying, "Don't act surprised. You know how this works." He chuckled. "Still within policy." Marcus didn't speak. He tapped again. The fourth image wasn't a video. It was still. A child's neck tilted at an unnatural angle. Hospital report overlaid in silence. Age, 9. Cause of trauma, cervical dislocation. Suspect, Officer B. Rollins. Time of incident, 14:27. Brent's mouth stayed half open. The file zoomed in. Medical coding. Then, slowly, a second document appeared. A birth certificate. Name, Elijah Marcus Rowe. Brent's breath hitched. Marcus looked at him, not with rage, not even pain, just weight, gravity, weaponized. Brent's throat tightened. His voice dropped half an octave. That kid ran at me. I told him to stop," Marcus replied evenly. He had a toy train in his hand. He bent him backwards over a squad car hood. Brent's smirk faltered. "I didn't know. You didn't care," Marcus corrected. Brent shook his head, suddenly restless. "You can't pin that on me. No court, no judge." "There's no jury here," Marcus said, voice cold as justice's edge. "Only the record." Brent's mouth moved, but no sound came out. His hands flexed against the cuffs, metal scraping the table in weak defiance. "You're lying," he hissed. Marcus tapped the screen again. A scanned drawing appeared. Crayons on paper, crooked lines but clear enough, a figure in blue, larger than the rest, looming. Next to it, a stick figure with glasses and a cane. A child's scrawl beneath it read, "Don't let them hurt Grandpa." Brent stared at it, at the child's name, at the reality of what the badge had become. "You did that," Marcus said softly, "and you laughed about it, in a locker room." Brent stood suddenly, chair scraping harshly against the floor, arms jerking against the cuffs. "This isn't how this works. You don't get to be the judge." Marcus stood too, calmly, precisely. Not to match anger, but to overpower it by restraint. "I'm not the judge," he said. "I'm the consequence." The room didn't shake, but Brent did. Behind the glass, unseen, agents watched in silence. No notes, no talking, just the unraveling of a man who'd spent his life convinced no door would ever close behind him. But this one had, and Marcus Rowe held the key. The silence inside the holding cell wasn't peaceful. It was surgical, the kind that slices past pride and peels away anything that once resembled control. Brent Rollins sat on the metal bench, jaw locked, hands resting on his knees, eyes trained on nothing. His uniform was gone, his watch, his belt, even the boots he'd once stomped through lives with, gone. What remained was a state-issued gray, loose around the shoulders and tight at the throat. Outside the bars, the world had erupted. Every news outlet within broadcast range led with the same headline. "Cop who slapped elderly black man now center of 12 human rights complaints." Beneath it, a still frame from the courtroom footage. His hand mid-swing, his face a freeze frame of unchecked power. It was everywhere. CNN, MSNBC, local talk shows, even international outlets. No commentary softened the facts. No host dared play devil's advocate. The image said enough. Then came the video. Someone, an internal leak, maybe a former colleague, had uploaded raw footage from an old body cam archive. It showed Brent pushing a man during a nighttime arrest. The man stumbled, struck his head on a curb, and fell limp. Brent stood over him and laughed. Not a nervous chuckle, not a defensive smirk, a full, uninhibited laugh, the kind that echoes even when the clip ends. Social media detonated again. Hashtags morphed from "You slapped the wrong man" to "Brent laughs at pain." Memes flooded in, side by side with Brent's laughter and the frozen frame of the unconscious man. A supercut of every time Brent mocked a suspect, looped over trap beats and dubbed the sound of rot. Inside the holding facility, Brent's hands clenched and unclenched. He'd seen the clips. The guards hadn't said anything, but their glances had changed. No longer wary, just disgusted. He picked up the phone mounted to the wall of the holding cell and punched in a number he knew by heart. It rang. Once, twice, then connected. A male voice answered, familiar, polished. "It's me," Brand said, voice low but firm. "You've seen what's going on." "Yes," the voice replied, flat. "I need you to file injunctions. Block everything. Motion to suppress. Flip the public narrative. You know how this works." Silence. Then, calmly, the voice responded, "I'm not representing you." Brent blinked, confused. "What?" "I said," the voice repeated, tone like a legal brief being shredded, "I don't represent trash." For the first time since the metal door had shut, Brent's body shifted. He stood fully upright, spine stiff, as if posture alone could bring the world back into orbit. "You've been my lawyer for 10 years, and that was my mistake," Brent hissed into the phone, voice slicing like broken glass. "You think I'll go down alone? tone. "I don't care who drowns with you, but I'm not handing you a life jacket." Click, the line went dead. He stood motionless for several seconds, phone still in hand, the dial tone screaming into his ear like a judgment no judge had issued yet. His other hand shook, not from fear but from something worse. Realization. The mask had cracked, not on camera, not on paper, but in silence. There would be no deals, no clean exits. The shield he wore wasn't a badge anymore. It was an artifact, a relic of arrogance wrapped in bureaucracy, and the world had stopped worshiping it. The door to his cell buzzed once. A guard opened it but didn't look at him, just tossed in a folded jumpsuit. "You've been reassigned. Media pressure. They want you out of public sight." Brent didn't respond. He just stared at the gray cloth in his hand. Not a uniform, not even a disguise, just fabric, like everyone else. And for the first time in his career, Brent Rollins had no costume left, only the face of a man who believed he was untouchable, until the system decided it was done lying for him. The gavel fell with a metallic crack, slicing through murmurs like a cleaver through silk. Brent Rollins sat in the defendant's chair, eyes sunken, jaw tight, the county-issued suit hanging off his frame like borrowed skin. His cuffed hands twitched slightly, almost imperceptibly. The courtroom air was too still, the kind that builds pressure just before it caves in. The judge called the next witness. There was no music, no announcement, just a name. Luther Amos Rowe. Silence. Then the doors opened, and the courtroom rose. Not in obedience, in reverence. Luther stepped in with the grace of a man who had carried the weight of quiet battles for decades. No cane, no hand on his back, just presence. His posture wasn't defiant, it was intact. Time had bent him, but not broken him. The scars didn't show on his skin, but they pulsed beneath it like old drums. Quiet, but unforgotten. Every eye turned. Even the cameras still. Even the dust in the light seemed to hesitate mid-air. Brandt's voice cracked through the silence like a whip. "That's him," he snarled, half standing, venom bleeding through panic. "That old bastard. He's the reason I'm here." His voice echoed too loudly, too fast, too raw, and it landed wrong. Not like thunder, more like a child slamming a door and calling it war. Marcus rose from his seat. No gesture, no pause, just words, clear, unshaken, edged with something colder than steel. "No," he said. "He's the reason I still believe in law." The room didn't erupt. It inhaled. Luther reached the witness stand with deliberate steps. He placed a hand on the railing, not for support, but acknowledgement. The clerk offered the oath. He nodded once. His voice was calm, soft, but impossibly firm. "I do." They asked the questions. The prosecutors, sharp and brief. He answered with restraint, precision, never letting pain spill into pity. "I didn't see his hand coming," he said of the slap, "but I've seen that face before." "Did you provoke the officer?" He blinked. "By standing?" Every answer struck like a drum, played slowly and deliberately. "What did you do after he hit you?" "I stood," he said simply, "and I adjusted my collar." Marcus watched from the bench. His hands folded, his spine upright. Brent shifted in his seat like the walls had crept closer. The press leaned forward. Reporters clutched pens that hadn't moved since Luther entered the room. The defense attempted cross-examination. Brent's attorney, his fifth in a week, stood awkwardly, eyes flicking to Brent like he was confirming his allegiance under duress. "Mr. Rowe, did you insult Officer Rollins that day?" "No," Luther replied. "I didn't open my mouth." "Did you resist?" "I blinked." "Do you consider the force excessive?" Luther looked at the man, not with heat, but with depth. "I consider it unnecessary and unworthy." The room held that word, like glass. Unworthy. Brent leaned forward, voice low, unfiltered. "You people always play the victim, always twisting it." The judge banged the gavel. "Defendant will remain silent." But the damage was done. The cameras caught it, the jury heard it. The country, watching, felt it. Luther did not flinch. He simply turned toward Brent, not dramatically, not theatrically, but with the quiet weight of a man who had learned that real power doesn't shout. Brent looked away, not because he chose to, because he had to. And Marcus, he never moved. But his eyes spoke everything. "You lost when you touched a man, who didn't need to fight back to win. The cross-examination concluded, but the room didn't settle. The atmosphere was charged, like static before a lightning strike. The judge gave a nod, signaling that Luther could step down. He didn't rush. He rose slowly, methodically, his eyes sweeping the courtroom, not to claim it, but to remind it of presence, of restraint, of dignity held through violence. As he turned to leave the stand, every seat remained upright. Even the bailiff stood again. The jury, unprompted, followed. There was no precedent for this kind of quiet salute, but precedent had long since left the building. This wasn't about protocol anymore. This was about respect earned, not demanded. Brent tried to look defiant, but his shoulders sagged. The suit hung heavier on his frame, as if even fabric had learned to reject him. He avoided Luther's eyes, staring instead at a crack in the table, jaw clenched so tight it made the veins in his neck pulse. Outside, the courthouse steps were surrounded by reporters, flashbulbs firing like artillery. But inside, no one dared speak until Luther exited the chamber and disappeared behind the heavy oak doors. The judge recessed for lunch. Jurors filed out in silence. Even the defense counsel avoided eye contact, moving with the hesitance of someone chained to a man already sinking. Marcus remained seated. He didn't follow his father. He didn't approach Brent. He simply sat, spine straight, fingers laced, watching. Brent, unable to resist, looked over. "You proud of that, old man?" he muttered. "You think that performance changes anything?" Marcus didn't reply. He stood slowly, adjusted his jacket, then walked toward the exit, only stopping once he passed Brent's table. He didn't look down. He didn't lean in. He just said evenly, "That man taught me what silence can mean, and what violence should never be." Then he walked away. Brent gritted his teeth until his jaw throbbed. He wanted to shout, wanted to throw the table, the chair, and the chains around his wrists, but there was nothing left to destroy except himself, and even that wasn't his to control anymore. The afternoon session resumed with procedural witnesses, analysts, and forensic breakdowns, but the echo of Luther's testimony lingered in the air like smoke, clinging to every breath, every word spoken afterward, reducing everything else to static. By the end of the day, the court adjourned. As the crowd filed out, one reporter whispered to another, "No need to wait for the verdict. The moment already happened." And she wasn't wrong. The trial would continue. Testimonies, exhibits, rulings, arguments, they all still mattered. But what had taken place in that room, in those few minutes with an old man who refused to bend under insult, had shifted the balance. It wasn't just that Luther had spoken. It was that he had spoken exactly enough. As Marcus walked toward the exit of the building that day, his phone buzzed once. A message from the bureau. "Tomorrow's schedule holds. Witness prep confirmed. Pressure on Brent's legal team is mounting. Internal Affairs is requesting early access to evidence transcripts." He locked the screen. Didn't reply. Some days were made for action. This one had been made for truth, and truth delivered in silence, shaped by restraint and armored by dignity, had never looked so devastating. It began under the lights, too bright, too hot, too unforgiving. Brent Rollins sat at the witness table like a man rehearsing invincibility, but his skin betrayed him. The sweat came early, not from heat, but from exposure. Cameras were locked on him. The trial had shifted into open broadcast. Every word would echo into living rooms, boardrooms, and classrooms. There would be no redacting the truth now. The prosecutor began with composure, but Marcus had designed the outline. Each question was a cut, not deep enough to end, but precise enough to bleed. Brent's answers started strong, short, firm, but beneath each syllable, desperation pulsed like a drum. "Did you use excessive force on March 17th? No. Then explain this body cam footage." The screen behind them flickered to life. Brent is on patrol, a suspect in cuffs, a boot pressing down just a second too long. The groan, the laugh, Brent's voice. "He deserved a little reminder." The jury flinched. Brent blinked. That's edited." Marcus, seated near the prosecution, didn't speak. He didn't need to. The data did it for him. April 3rd, witness intimidation. False. Another clip. Brent outside a holding cell whispering through the bars, "Say it right or I'll make the next few hours feel like years." "That's out of context," Brent snapped. May 22nd, teenager hospitalized. "Your report claimed he fell. That's what I saw. Your partner filed a contradiction." Silence. Then came the financial records, surveillance timelines, call logs between Brent and local judges, the one-way deals. The favors were exchanged. Every denial Brent attempted was met with a timestamp, a recording, a written complaint. He began to speak faster, angrier. "You people think you know what it takes out there? We keep order. We stop chaos." "You created chaos," the prosecutor said coolly. "You just wore the right badge while doing it." The cross-examination didn't slow. It sharpened. Marcus had crafted it like a scalpel forged from cold data and colder memory. Brent began slipping, contradicting himself, changing stories mid-anon. The cameras caught everything, the jaw clenching, the eyes darting, the fingers tapping, each tap faster than the last. By the end of the day, Brent no longer answered. He reacted to shadows, to questions, to facts that once rolled off him like water, now slicing into flesh. Back at the detention center, word had already spread. The live stream played in the common room. Officers, some who had once served with him, others who had long suspected him, watched without sympathy. One of them leaned against the wall, arms folded. "That him?" he asked, nodding toward the screen. Another scoffed. "Used to be." The third lifted the hem of his shirt, revealing a vest with FTO Rawlins scrawled on the inside. "Guess it's vintage now," he smirked, letting it fall. They didn't speak to Brent when he returned from court. They didn't acknowledge him when he passed. Just eyes, cold, unflinching. The silence of men who had decided no badge could save someone from his rot. In the cafeteria, Brent sat alone, fork frozen mid-air. Across the room, two guards laughed, not at him directly, but loud enough. "Saw the broadcast," one said. "Damn shame. Thought he was the top dog." The other snorted. "Yeah, top of the trash pile." The metal tray clattered as Brent stood too fast. No one flinched. No one rose. The guards didn't even turn. The uniform he wore wasn't cloth anymore. It was history unraveling, thread by thread. And Marcus, he didn't need to be there. His work was in motion. The system Brent had once bent had started snapping back, and it was using his weight to crush him. Later that night, Brent sat in his cell, with the fluorescent lights humming above like they, too, judged him. He hadn't touched his dinner. The tray remained on the floor, where he'd kicked it earlier, its contents scattered like the pieces of his last defense. The walls felt closer now, not just in space, but in memory. He replayed the courtroom footage in his head, the prosecutor's questions, Marcus's stillness, the clips of himself he had once considered trophies now broadcast as evidence. He'd laughed then, called it control, command. Now it played back like a confession. He stood and paced, his steps short, clipped, like the room resisted each turn. On the other side of the bars, a younger officer leaned against the wall, scrolling through his phone. Brent approached, stopped just shy of the barrier. "You work this wing?" he asked, voice low. The officer didn't look up. "Until my shift ends." Brent swallowed. "I trained guys like you." "Yeah," the officer said, eyes still on the screen. "That's what they said about dinosaurs, too." The words hit harder than a shove. Brent turned back into his cell, gripping the edges of the metal sink until his knuckles paled. He could hear them, even now. Guards in the hallway, chuckling over a meme. It was him, that freeze frame of his face, mid-shout, spliced with the phrase, unlawful but confident. He sat back down, forcing himself to breathe through his nose. He had always counted on strength, the badge, the fear he instilled. Now, none of those things returned his calls. Even his attorney had begun communicating through assistants. No messages of encouragement, only scheduling conflicts. At lights out, he lay on the cot, staring up at the concrete above him. There was a a crack, thin but visible. He'd memorized it. It curved left, then split near the end. It hadn't moved in days, but tonight he swore it had lengthened. The next morning he was led back to court. This time the crowd didn't buzz as he entered. There was no confusion, no noise, just quiet recognition. The jury barely looked at him. They were busy reading transcripts handed out before testimony resumed. Pages filled with timelines, receipts, statements, each one another inch of rope he'd tied himself. The prosecution called the next witness, a former officer, one of Brent's old trainees. "Did you witness Officer Rawlins use unauthorized tactics during your time together?" The man nodded. "Yes." "Did you report them?" "No." "Why not?" He paused. "Because I thought he was untouchable." Brent shifted in his seat. His face twitched, but he held his tongue. "Barely." The questioning continued. "Did Officer Rawlins ever tell you the rules didn't apply to him?" "He didn't need to. We saw it every day." From the corner of the courtroom, Marcus watched. No notepad, no gestures, just stillness. Again, he didn't need to crush Brent with questions. Brent was collapsing under the weight of his echoes. His words were coming back now, carried by those who used to repeat them with pride. Turned witness, turned mirror. Back at the detention center that evening, Brent returned to his cell alone. The door slid shut behind him with a deeper thud than usual, as if the system had spoken, not with verdicts, but with consequences. That night, the laughter didn't stop. Guards, inmates, even the TV in the common area played a comedy sketch, a parody with the character in uniform slapping civilians while yelling, "I am the law." The actor wore a wig, Brent's haircut, his mustache. Someone turned up the volume. In the dark, Brent curled on the cot, knees bent, jaw clenched, eyes wide open. Not from rage, from knowing. The mask was gone. The echo chamber had cracked, and the man who thought he couldn't fall had finally stopped hearing his voice bouncing back. The silence that followed Brent's televised collapse didn't bring relief. It brought something colder. It lingered in the cement hallways, soaked into the fibers of his uniform, and clung to the corners of his breath. He was no longer the man who once commanded rooms with a stare and emptied voices with a word. The world had spoken, and now he waited. In the holding cell he sat hunched, elbows on knees, fingers twitching without rhythm. The guards didn't address him by name anymore, just nods. Doors opened with clicks, not calls. The badge that had once preceded him now might as well have been a scarlet letter stitched across his chest. He wasn't a threat anymore. He was inventory. That morning, hours before sentencing, the door buzzed and opened. Marcus Rowe stepped inside. No entourage, no briefcase, no FBI windbreaker or theatrical entrance. Just him. Brent's head snapped up. His face, pale with sleeplessness, twisted into something between a snarl and a smirk. Well, he said, voice rough from disuse. "If it isn't the son of the man who ruined me." Marcus didn't respond. He didn't need to. His presence alone unsettled more than 1,000 reporters. He walked forward, unhurried, and took the seat across from him. "You here to gloat?" Brent asked, squinting at him like the lighting itself was a betrayal. "No," Marcus said flatly. "I'm here because the law still allows you one final conversation before judgment." Brent leaned back, mouth curling. "And what, you want closure? Want to look the villain in the eyes and feel righteous?" Marcus's stare didn't shift. "I've looked at villains before. You're just louder." That struck. Brent's nostrils flared. "I kept order," he barked. "I held the line while people like you sat behind desks pushing paper. I walked into hellholes so your kind didn't have to." Marcus didn't blink. "No, you walked into neighborhoods and called them war zones. You walked into their lives and treated them like threats. And you thought the badge made you untouchable." Brent slammed his fist on the table, metal ringing. "I was an officer, a protector." "You were a predator," Marcus replied, his voice cutting like wire pulled tight. "And the only thing you protected was the illusion that men like you were above consequence." Brent stood, trembling with indignation. "I was a hero." Marcus didn't rise. His words dropped with more weight than movement could. "A hero," he said, "doesn't slap a 72-year-old man and call it justice." That stopped Brent cold. His knees buckled slightly, and he dropped back into the seat like his legs had betrayed him. He looked away, jaw clenching, eyes glaring. Then the anger returned, sharp, ugly. "What did you think this would get you?" he sneered. "You think the world will change because of this trial? You think they'll put your picture on a wall and say, 'That's the one who cleaned up the system'?" Marcus leaned forward slightly, not aggressive but direct, surgical. "I didn't do it to be remembered," he said. "I did it so that men like you stop thinking they are the system." Brent breathed hard. For the first time, it sounded like fear, not fury. "You'll never be done with people like me," he said, quieter now. "You cut off one, another grows back." "Maybe," Marcus said. "But today the cutting starts." Brent slumped back. His shoulders sank, his mouth parted, but no sound came out. There were no more grand speeches, no more slogans wrapped in authority, only air and weight. Marcus stood. Brent didn't. As Marcus moved to the door, Brent managed to whisper, "I hope it eats you alive." Marcus stopped, turned halfway. "No," he said. "It fuels me." He walked out without looking back. Behind him, Brent sat frozen, surrounded not by enemies but by the void left when even arrogance finally deserts you. The door clicked shut behind Marcus, but Brent stayed seated, eyes pinned to the space he'd just occupied, as if it could still absorb the blow that had landed without sound. It wasn't the volume that wounded, it was the precision. The man across from him hadn't flinched, hadn't cursed, hadn't delivered threats or sought pity. He had simply named Brent for what he was, and in doing so, had stripped him of the last illusion he had clung to. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time had started to distort since the trial began. The certainty Brent once wore like armor was now a shroud, suffocating him from within. The cell felt smaller. The air tasted different. Metallic, bitter, like copper left too long in the mouth. He tried to stand again, but found himself sitting back down without knowing why. His legs worked, his spine still held, but something fundamental had cracked. Not the kind of crack visible on the surface, the deeper kind, the kind that traveled down the marrow, silent and irreversible. The words echoed. A hero doesn't slap a 72-year-old man and call it justice. He had told himself that line, "They don't understand what it's like out there." So many times it had become a mantra. Now it sounded pathetic, even to him. The truth had been exposed, not just to the public or a jury, but to himself, and he hated it. Worse, he feared it. Back in the hallway, Marcus walked with calm purpose. Every step felt final, but not heavy. There was no triumph in his expression, only completion. No adrenaline, no surge of emotion. Just the knowledge that justice, in its most mechanical and unflinching form, had landed where it needed to. He didn't savor Brant's brokenness, he simply acknowledged it. One of the guards nodded as he passed, not in greeting, but in understanding. The kind of look exchanged between professionals who've seen too much, but still choose to believe the system has enough gears that can be turned back into alignment. As he exited into the morning light, a reporter spotted him through the glass doors and made a move forward, microphone half raised. Marcus shook his head once. The message was clear. No comment. This wasn't for the media. This was personal and sacred. Back in the cell, Brent finally moved. Slowly, like a man remembering how to exist. He rubbed his hands together, staring at the calluses. Once, they had meant strength. Now they were just the residue of a past that no longer protected him. He thought of his old unit, the men who used to look up to him, the officers who laughed at his jokes, mirrored his tactics. He'd worn their loyalty like a throne. But where were they now? He knew the answer. Some had turned state's witness. Others transferred quietly. A few sent messages, short, cold, like severed limbs. Can't be associated. Good luck. Hope it works out. No one had said, "I believe you." Not one. And worst of all, deep down, Brent no longer believed himself either. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, and whispered aloud as if trying to recover something already lost, and kept order. The words hung in the air, weightless, hollow, a child's plea dressed in authority. But there was no audience left, no badge, no shield, no system whispering back, "You did well." Only silence, only the cell, only the distant echo of a son who had spoken with clarity, without rage, without vengeance, just truth. He did it so that men like you stop thinking they are the system. It hadn't been theatrical. There was no roar, no tear, no fist to the sky, just the reckoning. And Brent, former officer, former symbol, former believer in his myth, was left alone, not with regret, but with the more corrosive twin, recognition. The courtroom was behind him now. Brent was behind him. The roar of cameras, the public dissection, the vengeance everyone assumed he wanted, left behind. What remained was silence, the kind that lived in wood-paneled halls and federal buildings carved from marble, where justice wasn't screamed, but whispered into policy. Marcus Rowe sat alone at the witness table in the United States Capitol, beneath a seal older than any name spoken in that room. Cameras were rolling. Lawmakers watched. The world waited. But Marcus, as always, didn't perform. He prepared. His voice didn't carry like a preacher's. It didn't crack like an actor's. It landed steady, deliberate, exact, the way a scalpel lands when there's rot beneath the skin. "I won't speak today about Brent Rollins," he began, gaze calm, posture still. "His story has already been televised, quoted, reinterpreted, and condemned, and in truth his story was never the point." There was a pause, not dramatic, but necessary. "I want to talk to you about my father." He reached into his coat, pulled out a small, worn photo, the one viewers had seen months ago in documentaries, op-eds, and viral posts. But this time, it wasn't a symbol, it was testimony. "This was taken in 1967, he said. "My father was younger than I am now. He stood beside a pastor in Birmingham, demanding to be seen as equal in the country that taxed him, policed him, and tried to erase him. Some committee members leaned in, others folded their arms. All listened. Was arrested that day, beaten, called things I won't repeat here because you already know the words. They've outlived their usefulness." Marcus set the photo flat on the table. His hands were steady, never struck back, not once. And he didn't teach me to either. He taught me to trust the law, not because it was flawless, but because if people like us stopped believing in it, there would be nothing left but fire. The room stayed still, so I became part of the law. I didn't become a protester. I didn't become a preacher. I became a blade inside the machine. Not to cut blindly, but to cut clean. He scanned the chamber slowly. What I discovered was not just corruption. It wasn't just one man drunk on power, hiding behind a badge. It was the doors that stayed open for him. Paperwork that disappeared, silence that brought careers, a web of polite rot. No one interrupted. He leaned forward, his voice dropping, not in volume, but in gravity. "Let me be clear, this wasn't a story about a racist cop. That's too easy. That lets the system off the hook. What I exposed was the normalization of violence, the administrative shielding of abuse, and the unspoken rule that some bodies matter less when weighed on the scales of American law." One of the senators scribbled something. Marcus continued. "My father was slapped by a man in uniform. The country saw the video. Some were horrified. Some made memes. Some tried to justify it." He paused again, not because he faltered, but because silence, when used correctly, sharpens words. My father didn't flinch. He didn't sue. He didn't shout. He just looked back at that officer with dignity. And that was the moment I knew. I had to move, not with fists, but with facts. Not with fury, but with federal leverage. A ripple went through the room, the kind of shift you could feel before applause, except no one clapped. Not yet. Marcus raised his eyes again. "You brought me here today to ask what needs to change. Let me tell you, not just oversight, not just transparency. We need guilt to be operational. We need silence to be punished. We need badges to mean service, not immunity." He breathed, slow and controlled. "We need the system to fear its failure more than it fears its own image." That landed hard. I don't want a statue. I don't want a medal. I want paperwork to stop disappearing. I want complaints to stop being jokes. I want justice to be less about drama and more about maintenance. Now, the tension broke. One senator nodded. Another uncrossed her arms. The chamber wasn't just listening, they were shifting. Marcus ended it clean. "My father was hit," I responded, "not because I'm angry, because I still believe, and belief, when backed by truth, should not have to yell to be heard." He sat back. Done. No one spoke for 3 full seconds. Then a single chair scraped, followed by another and another, until the entire chamber stood. No applause, just presence. It was more powerful that way. As Marcus gathered his things, one senior member leaned across the mic and said, "Not for the cameras, but for the record, this is the man who cleaned the blade." And Marcus, he didn't look back. He walked out of the chamber the same way he'd walked into the interrogation room, the same way he'd walked out of the courtroom, with the quiet certainty of a man who had done what needed to be done, without fire, without fame, without flinching. The courtroom wasn't packed with cameras or buzzing with drama. It had the feel of something final but unceremonious, like the quiet closing of a heavy vault door. No signs, no chants, no slogans bouncing off marble, just quiet, clean, cold, and decisive. Brent Rollins sat with his back straight, face locked in the same defiant expression he had worn since day one. His uniform was gone. The fitted blue had been replaced by the drab gray of holding. No badge, no belt, no nameplate. He looked smaller now, not physically, but in presence. The air that once inflated his arrogance had slowly drained with every damning piece of evidence, every broken testimony, every name carved into the indictment like cuts across a ledger of impunity. The judge's voice was firm but not loud. "Brent Edward Rollins, this court finds you guilty of 12 counts, including obstruction of justice, abuse of power, excessive use of force under color of law, and violation of civil rights resulting in bodily harm and death. For these crimes, you are hereby sentenced to 25 years in a federal correctional facility. This sentence is non-negotiable. There will be no parole." There was no cheer, no gasp, not even a whisper. The words settled into the room like dust over a battlefield already silent. Brent's face didn't twitch. He sat like a statue sculpted from defiance and denial, but the cracks showed. Tiny ones at the edge of his mouth, the hollow press beneath his cheekbones, the way his eyes kept returning to the judge's hands, as if he still expected the verdict to shift, for someone to call a halt, for someone to remember who he used to be. But no one did. The attorneys didn't pat him on the back. His former precinct didn't send anyone. The seat once held by Judge Reed was now occupied by a woman who had built her career on reform. She didn't speak during sentencing. She didn't have to. Her presence was the system's final reply. Somewhere outside, cameras had begun to click again. The world was already chewing on the outcome, but in the courtroom, time moved differently, slower, heavier, and Marcus Rowe was not there. He hadn't shown up for the sentencing. His work had ended the moment the final document was filed. He had said what he needed to say to Brent. The rest, he believed, belonged not to him, but to the very system his father once taught him to believe in, and that he had spent every breath proving could still stand, if someone was willing to carry it through fire. Still, a photo was taken from across the street. At exactly 9:04 a.m., a news photographer captured Marcus standing alone in the shadow of a statue no one paid attention to anymore. His suit was plain. His expression is unreadable. He wasn't watching anything in particular, but his gaze was aimed toward the courthouse windows, those same windows through which Brent Rollins had once looked out with a smirk during the preliminary hearings. Marcus didn't move. He didn't wave. He didn't speak to the camera. The photographer uploaded the image later that afternoon without comment, but an editor, recognizing the weight of that silent silhouette, added a caption, "The man who returned justice to its rightful shape." The image didn't trend globally, it wasn't meme-worthy, but it was passed quietly between inboxes. Judges, aides, attorneys, and staffers. Those who knew. Those who understood what it meant to bend the law without breaking it, to strike without bloodlust, to dismantle power without becoming the monster it once served. Back in his office, Marcus cleaned out his temporary desk. The task force had been dissolved that morning. Files archived, Evidence sealed, all loose ends are bound with federal tape. He closed the final folder, Case 519C, and placed it in the outgoing tray. He didn't sigh, didn't reflect aloud. He simply glanced at the wall where a photo of his father used to hang during the investigation. He'd taken it down the day the arrest went through. Now, in its place was a blank pinboard, clean, ready for whatever came next. Across the city, Brandt was being led in cuffs through an underground tunnel that smelled like bleach and resignation. The agents escorting him didn't speak. He tried once to make a joke, "Federal justice, but the feds are proud of themselves today." No one replied. His voice fell into the sterile air like a coin into an empty well. The transport van took him to a processing center outside the city where a new ID number replaced his name. A small barcode was printed on a wristband he couldn't remove. No press was there, no handshake, no salvation. Meanwhile, in a quiet government building, a young intern was asked to print and summarize the case findings for internal circulation. She read the report, read Marcus's name, highlighted it, and wrote a small note at the top of her memo. Justice executed without vengeance. Later that week, a column appeared on the back page of a legal review journal written by a retired judge. It didn't mention Brent by name. It didn't glorify Marcus. It simply posed a question. What happens when the law is wielded not to punish, but to protect those it once failed? There was no answer printed beneath it. None was needed. That was the power of what had just occurred. A story that didn't scream. A justice that didn't gloat. A man who didn't need to sit in court to make the walls feel his presence. Brent Rollins had been sentenced, but Marcus Rowe had delivered something rarer than punishment. He had forced the mirror back into the hands of the institution itself, and for once, it didn't shatter, it simply stared back. There was no press conference, no public medal, no framed plaque. What came instead was subtler, heavier policy. Internal affairs divisions across several states adopted mandatory audit trails based on Marcus Rowe's submission templates. New lines of code were added to evidence management systems. Flags that couldn't be disabled, threads that couldn't be severed without generating alerts to oversight boards. People didn't call it reform, they called it a repair. Inside one city's police academy, an ethics instructor opened a lecture with a quote from the Gray Standards report. She didn't say who Marcus was. She didn't need to. Every recruit had read the piece, not because it was assigned, but because it had become required reading in the unspoken curriculum of fear and consequence. Across forums once known for their closed-door cynicism, veteran officers now debated out loud, not whether what Brent did was wrong, they knew it was, but whether their silence had turned wrongdoing into procedure. One officer wrote anonymously, "The sound of that door kicking in wasn't just about Brent. It was about the fact that we let him think no one ever would. It wasn't heroism that stuck. It was the redefinition of accountability. Unromantic, unsentimental, unignorable." Meanwhile, community leaders cited the article in neighborhood meetings, in barbershops, in school board forums, not to glorify Marcus, but to mark a shift. This system, one pastor said during a town hall, wasn't brought down by riots or slogans, cracked because one man kept receipts. Somewhere in a basement archive, the original copy of Brent Rollins' internal file, the one with the suppressed complaints, erased footage, ghosted testimony, was stamped in red, closed. Subject prosecuted. Right beneath it, a handwritten note was taped by a junior archivist. This time, we didn't bury it. In those months, the Gray Standards editorial office received thousands of letters. Survivors, former officers, civilians. One envelope had no return address, only a card inside with 10 words. "You printed what we lived. You printed what they hid." A law professor at Georgetown wrote an op-ed in The Atlantic titled "The Marcus Rowe Effect: Institutional Guilt Without Institutional Collapse." In it, she dissected how the case had avoided the typical pendulum public outrage followed by systemic defensiveness. Instead, it had cut so deeply and precisely, the wound had to be addressed rather than dismissed. Her last paragraph read, "It turns out, a scalpel is sometimes more terrifying than a sword." The effect wasn't an immediate revolution. It was recalibration. Quiet, technical, relentless. Brent Rollins faded from headlines faster than anyone expected. No martyrdom, no televised appeal, just a number in a system he once manipulated with impunity. But his absence left a vacuum, and inside that vacuum, people started asking the questions he had silenced for nearly 2 decades. In an obscure podcast episode, one retired agent was asked what he thought of Marcus Rowe. He paused, then said, "It's clean. There's by the book. And then there's Rowe. He didn't bend the law, but he made it bow back to its purpose." Back in Winston Hill, an artist painted a mural outside the old courthouse. It wasn't Marcus's face. It was the image of a hand holding a worn-out file folder, cracked spine, redacted tabs, and on it, the words, "Truth," filed. Weeks later, a nonprofit was formed, named not after Marcus or Luther, but simply No More Closures. Its mission wasn't grand. It digitized complaint records, offered free legal navigation for those filing against officers, and educated citizens on how to access public documents. Its first seminar opened with a slide that read, "Silence isn't neutral, it's permission." And Marcus? He didn't speak to the press. He declined interviews. He declined panels. But the silence didn't feel evasive anymore. It felt deliberate, like the silence of someone who had no more to prove, no more to explain, no appetite for legacy, just room to breathe. He was seen once, months later, at a federal transparency symposium, sitting in the back row, not listed as a speaker, not invited to the panel, just observing. Someone snapped a photo. The caption didn't even name him. It read, "A man watching the room that once refused to look back." That was the final blow, the cultural shift, not made of applause, but of acknowledgement. Justice didn't wear a cape. It wore a badge it refused to dishonor. It didn't shout. It marked, it remembered, and the coffin that once held the illusion of invincibility, it was nailed shut not by rage, not by protest, but by a file folder, a USB, a signature on a warrant, a closed case file, and a line in a report that couldn't be unread. He never pulled the trigger, but the hammer fell exactly where it should have. The wood of the old porch creaked softly under their weight, but neither Marcus nor Luther moved. They sat in silence, 2 generations divided by time, but stitched together by something stronger than blood, resolve. The sun was beginning its slow descent, bleeding gold across the sky and throwing long shadows that stretched like quiet memories across the lawn. The house behind them, modest and square, stood still as if holding its breath. On the table between them, an envelope rested with deliberate casualness, its edges curled from use, from having been opened and closed so many times that it no longer held its original stiffness. Marcus had unfolded it earlier, scanning the contents not for information but for something deeper, for reason, for resonance. The letter inside, scrawled in blue crayon, was short. "Dear Mr. Marcus, my name is Caleb. I'm 7. My mom showed me the video. She said, you're a man of justice. I don't know what that means yet, but I know I want to be like you, only I won't hit people, I promise. Love, Caleb." Marcus had read it 3 times, not because he needed to, but because it disarmed him in a way courtrooms and confessions never could. A child's clarity had managed what months of procedural justice hadn't. It reached the part of him still human, still vulnerable, the part that reminded him of why he had started this path in the first place. Luther hadn't said much when Marcus handed him the letter. He just looked at it, eyes scanning the uneven lines, lips pressed into a thin line that held neither smile nor sorrow. When he finished, he folded it once, set it down on the wood grain, and returned to his coffee. They hadn't spoken since. But the silence between these two wasn't absent. It was punctuation. The rocking chairs moved slowly, back and forth, not in rhythm but in understanding. The porch, once a place for escape from heat and noise, now served as a front row seat to the aftermath of justice. Messy, unglamorous, real. Marcus watched the sky without really seeing it. His thoughts were not forward-facing. They were reflective. The tribunal, the evidence, the sentence, all of it felt like sharp instruments in careful hands. But now those instruments were down, and what remained wasn't a celebration. It was stillness. It was completion. "You didn't speak today," Luther said finally, his voice worn like the porch underfoot, but steady. Marcus didn't turn. "I didn't need to. And yet, that boy wrote you. Because words reach places court orders can't." Luther gave a faint nod. "He'll grow up thinking you're the reason the world makes sense." "No," Marcus said almost immediately. "He'll grow up knowing someone pushed back. That's all I need." The conversation dissolved again, not awkwardly, but like ash in water. Inevitable. Quiet. A breeze moved through the branches overhead, rustling the leaves just enough to remind them that the world hadn't stopped. Marcus reached out and placed a fingertip on the envelope. It didn't move, but he could feel its weight, not physical, but emotional. A boy somewhere believed in him, not because he won a case, but because he had held his silence while making the system scream. Luther watched his son. "I know what you didn't say in court," he said. Marcus turned to him now, his expression unreadable. "You didn't tell them about the nights you sat in that room with his file open for hours? You didn't tell them how many people said, 'Don't bother'? How many doors slammed before one opened?" "I didn't need applause," Marcus said quietly. "I needed clarity." "And did you get it?" "No," Marcus answered, then paused. "I gave it." A flicker of pride passed through Luther's eyes, but he didn't let it linger. He wasn't a man who praised easily, not because he lacked admiration, but because he believed praise could dull the blade of purpose. Instead, he offered something rarer. "You didn't take revenge," he said. "You did something far harder." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "What's harder than justice?" "Correction," Luther said. "Revenge demands anger. Justice demands proof. But correction, that demands restraint and patience and pain." The truth of it settled between them like another presence, visible, palpable, uninvited but welcome. They sat in it. The porch light clicked on automatically, casting warm amber across the weathered boards. It caught the edge of the letter, making the crayon shine faintly like a badge not made of metal, but of something purer. Marcus looked at the chair beside him, the one no one had sat in for years, his mother's chair. Its cushions were faded, but clean. He didn't move it, didn't reach out. He just looked at it. For once, it didn't seem empty. It seemed complete. "I used to think justice meant closure," Marcus said, voice barely above a breath. "Now I think it just means no one else has to carry the weight." Luther nodded, not in agreement, but in recognition. "And if they do?" Marcus turned to him. "Then we do this again. No drama, no declaration, just a quiet promise in the half-light between two men who knew what cost looked like." Luther leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking beneath the motion, and looked out into the distance where the sky had begun its shift into twilight. His eyes weren't clouded by age, not tonight. They were sharp, heavy with the knowledge of decades survived and history absorbed without ever raising his voice. He had seen marches, watched men bleed on pavement for a chance to vote, held his breath while judges wrote verdicts with fingers dripping with politics. And now, in the slowness of this evening, he was watching something far rarer, a system, even if only once, acknowledging its rot. Marcus caught the tone in his father's breath more than the words themselves. That kind of silence, where memory hummed louder than any sentence, was one he'd grown up under. It had taught him how to listen not to noise, but to what people tried not to say. That's how he found weak spots in witnesses. That's how he cracked Brent Rollins. He hadn't expected it would also teach him how to heal. "You know," Luther said finally, voice low, There was a time I thought none of this mattered. Marcus didn't interrupt. They'd knock us down and we'd get back up, sure, but I kept asking myself, for what? For another boot tomorrow? For another headline that fades in a week? Marcus's hands rested on his knees. He waited. But then I saw the way that boy spelled your name. Not agent, not FBI, just Mr. Marcus, like you were someone he could touch, not a symbol, a man. There was a pause before Marcus answered. I wasn't trying to be a symbol. Exactly, Luther said. And that's why it worked. The light wind brushed past them again, cooler now. Somewhere in the distance, a screen door banged and someone's dog barked once before being called back inside. Life kept moving, quietly, undisturbed. But here, in this pocket of stillness, something irreversible had happened. A system had been called out, not by rioters or banners or viral hashtags, but by precision, by law, by relentless truth. And now, with Brent's sentence sealed and history beginning its digestion of the moment, the Rowe men sat with what came after. Do you think he'll rot? Marcus asked. Not out of vengeance, but curiosity. Luther didn't answer right away. He took a sip of cold coffee, set the cup down without a sound. No, he said eventually. Men like him don't rot. They calcify, harden. They blame everyone else until they become stone, and stone doesn't break. It just sinks. Marcus thought about that, thought about Brent's face as the sentence was read aloud. It wasn't anger that consumed him, nor shame. It was confusion, the disbelief that a world once tilted in his favor could dare to correct itself. That disbelief had cracked something inside him. But Luther was right. It hadn't shattered him. It had simply turned him to stone. I didn't need him to break, Marcus said. Luther nodded. You needed the world to see he wasn't unbreakable. That was it. The purpose had never been destruction. It had been a revelation. To take off the badge, the lies, the silence, and show everyone what had been allowed to stand for too long. Marcus hadn't hunted Brent. He'd uncovered him. From inside the house, the clock struck a soft chime, 8 notes, slow, measured. Time was calling gently to remind them that night was falling. Neither man moved. There was nothing urgent now. No deadlines, no courtrooms, no press briefings, just breathe, just presence. Marcus reached for the letter again. Caleb's crayon had smudged slightly at the edges. The blue turned faintly green under the porch light. He wrote this not knowing what I did, Marcus said. About he knew why you did it, Luther replied, and that's enough. It was strange, Marcus thought, how something so heavy could be so quiet. The whole storm, videos, trials, protests, verdicts, had screamed through the country like a siren. But in the aftermath, the most powerful moment was this: a boy writing a letter and 2 men sitting with it. Nothing more, nothing less. The porch light buzzed faintly above them, casting a dim cone that made their shadows long across the wooden floorboards. Marcus sat forward now, elbows on his knees, the letter still clutched in his hand like it meant more than evidence ever could. Luther watched him, not with pride, that word was too small, but with a steady recognition of what the boy he raised had become. Not a hammer, not a martyr, but a scalpel. And when the time came, Marcus had cut clean. Have you ever thought about leaving it? Luther asked, voice quieter than the wind. The bureau? Marcus asked. Luther nodded. Marcus paused, jaw flexing once, then twice, every day. And every day I don't. The answer wasn't noble. It wasn't painted in justice or duty or hope. It was simple, like all hard truths. He didn't stay because he believed the system worked. He stayed because too many people believed it never could, and someone had to prove them wrong, even if just one. I'm not naive, Marcus said. This doesn't fix anything. No, Luther replied, but it reminds people that fixing is possible. That was the difference. That was what the Brent Rollins of the world never understood. They thought silence meant consent, that endurance meant defeat. But sometimes silence was just waiting, and endurance was the strategy. The system hadn't cracked open because of rage or noise. It had yielded because someone had the patience to outlast its lies and the precision to reveal them one at a time. The chair next to Luther creaked again as he shifted his weight. "You know what scares men like Brent?" he said, eyes still forward. Marcus shook his head. "Paperwork," Luther said. "Signatures, protocols. They think they can fight fists, bullets, even riots. But a man in a suit with a file folder? That's the thing they can't shoot their way out of." Marcus smiled faintly. It was the kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes, but carried a weight all its own. Because it was true, Brent Rawlins hadn't been brought down by fury or fire. He'd been undone by the same laws he'd twisted, the same badges he hid behind, the same silence he thought would shield him. That was the justice Marcus had chosen. Not revenge, not even retribution, but exposure. And now, with the sun fully gone and only a soft orange bleeding across the edge of the clouds, it was time to let it settle, to let it breathe. "You think the others will follow?" Marcus asked. He didn't have to name them. The ones still on the force, the ones still protected, the ones still unchecked. Luther exhaled slowly. "Some will dig deeper, some will run, but a few will sweat." "And that's enough?" Marcus asked. Luther nodded once. "For tonight." They said nothing more for a long time, the kind of quiet that didn't ask to be filled, the kind of silence earned only after a war when the last shot is fired, and both sides retreat into memory. When Marcus finally stood, the boards under his feet didn't creak. Even the house seemed to understand the weight of the moment. He placed the folded letter on the table beside his father, adjusted his collar, and looked toward the gravel road. "Tell Mom I said goodnight," he said. Luther gave him a look. "She's been gone 5 years." "I know," Marcus said. "She still listens." And with that, he walked off the porch and into the darkness. Not rushed, not hesitant, just calm, controlled. The way a man walks when he's no longer carrying vengeance, but something heavier, clarity. The next morning, the chair on the porch sat empty. Not abandoned, just unnecessary. Luther had folded the letter neatly, placed it back in its envelope, and set it on the mantel inside. It wasn't nostalgia that made him keep it. It was evidence that something had shifted, that even if the system hadn't healed, it had, for once, bled in the right direction. He sat by the window with a cup of black coffee, eyes tracing the line where sky met trees. Somewhere out there, Marcus was already back in Washington. The machine hadn't stopped. It wouldn't. But now there was a fracture in it, and through that crack, light could crawl in. A quiet knock came at the door. It wasn't the press. It wasn't noise. It was a girl, no more than 10, blonde, pale freckles, holding a sketchbook like a shield and a courage that didn't fit her size. Luther opened the door slowly. "Are you Marcus's dad?" He looked down. "Yes." He extended the sketchbook. It was open to a page, a hand-drawn figure in a suit, Marcus, unmistakably, with a badge in one hand and a gavel in the other. Not dramatic, not perfect, but unmistakably proud. "I want to be like him," she said, "but I won't need to hit anyone." Luther didn't smile. He didn't need to. He simply nodded and said, "Good, start there." The girl turned and left without waiting for praise. She didn't need it. She'd already seen what it looked like to do the right thing when no one was cheering. Inside, Luther sat back in his chair. The old wood creaked beneath him, a sound that now felt earned, not tired. Across the room, the news played with the volume low. They were still dissecting Brent Rawlins' conviction, still arguing whether justice had been served or was performative, still throwing headlines at walls to see what would stick. But Marcus wasn't in any of them. No comment, no spotlight, no interviews. He wasn't the headline, he was the correction. Outside, the wind picked up. Leaves swirled around the porch where the girl had stood. The sun hit the wood just right, casting the shadow of the empty chair long and defined across the floorboards. It looked like someone had just left, or maybe like someone never left at all. Legacy doesn't always come with applause. Sometimes it's the absence of what used to be broken. Sometimes it's a chair no one needs to sit in anymore. Sometimes it's a father who doesn't have to tell his son he's proud because the world already knows.